So how did we get to this point where there is so much hype about psychedelics, where we've got a psychedelics index like the ASX 500? Well, as a psychologist, I know the best way to predict future behaviour is to look at past behaviour, so going back through history. And I titled the presentation as Psychedelic Renaissance ? And the reason for that is that people have been using psychedelic drugs for a long time. For thousands of years, in different indigenous cultures, people have experimented with the use of various plants as medicines or to facilitate engagement in their spiritual practices. And so the idea that this is a renaissance, maybe it's a third wave. This is really the third wave of psychedelic research, because the first wave was happening long before it was even part of the Western conscious. So how did psychedelics become integrated? How did the Western culture become aware of psychedelics? Well, mescaline was isolated in the late 19th century, which is the key ingredient from peyote cactus, but that didn't really change a lot in terms of it changing the zeitgeist. What really happened in terms of the change and it entering Western culture was 1943, when Robert Hoffman was working on developing new medications that he was hoping would treat migraine. And one day he was accidentally exposed to one of these medications. He didn't feel so well, so he went home. He wasn't 100% sure what he was exposed to, but he had a pretty good idea of what it was. So 3 days later, he went back to the lab and intentionally ingested 250 micrograms of the said medication. Of course, the said medication was LSD. We know that 250 micrograms is a pretty solid dose of LSD. He realised that the lab was not the best place to be, and so he hopped on his bike and pedalled home. And because, in those days, 250 micrograms was a minute dose. People were taking medication in milligram ranges. People didn't take microgram ranges. This was an extremely powerful drug. And on his ride home, he described the beauty he saw in nature, how vivid the colours were, and he went on to self-experiment with LSD and recognised that it had these profound effects, but he couldn't figure out what they might be used for, how might they be useful. So Sandoz, the lab that he was working for, sent it out to researchers around the world to try and figure out what it could be used for. So they started off giving it to people with schizophrenia. That didn't work so well. I'm not sure what the rationale was, but it didn't go so well. At that time, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, these drugs were called psychomedics because they produced an effect that people believed mimicked psychosis. So they started to give it to psychiatrists to help psychiatrists develop empathy for their patients with schizophrenia. And philosophers started taking it to enhance their mental state and come up with new ideas. And probably the most well-known philosopher who's written about psychedelics was Huxley. So Aldous Huxley engaged with Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist overseeing LSD-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder, and he gave Huxley a dose of mescaline in May 1953, and Huxley had a profound experience. He wrote about this in a book called Doors of Perception, which is a tribute to William Blake's poem from the 19th century, in which William Blake stated, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his cavern." Huxley then encouraged other academics to try these psychedelic compounds. And of course, at this time, they were called psychomedics. The word psychedelic hadn't been invented, if you like. And so Huxley continued to correspond with Dr. Osmond, and he wrote to Dr. Osmond saying, "To make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram phenerum to mind," which means spiritness in ancient Greek. Osmond countered with, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of the psychedelic." Psychedelic therapy emerged, and by the 1970s there had been over 1,000 papers published on LSD, psychotherapy for alcohol use dependence. It was being used to treat existential angst among terminally ill. Two different types of psychotherapy emerged. Psychedelic therapy in the US, where people were given large doses that were intended to induce mystical states or profound states, whereas in Europe they were using psycholytic therapy, which is just to lower doses to loosen the mind. It wasn't microdosing, it was more of a lower dose for the treatment of neurosis, psychosomatic disorders. And so, you know, this research that occurred during this period of time, 1,000 papers, 10,000 patients, showing that this treatment with LSD or psilocybin assisted psychotherapy could be effective for any one of these conditions. And it was found to produce profound, rapid, long-lasting positive effects with little need for further investigation, unlike psychoanalysis, which involved years and years of treatment. So one of the researchers that was involved in psychedelic psychotherapy was Dr. Timothy Leary, Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. So Leary did some great work. He was one of the supervisors of the Pankey study, the Good Friday study, where theologians in a randomised controlled trial were given psilocybin on Good Friday. The timing given today's Thursday. But Leary's methodology started to get loose. His patients were sleeping on his couch in his house, and in the end, you know, he was pretty much willing to give LSD, or not willing, wanting to give LSD to anybody that would take it. And so he was fired from Harvard University. But by this stage, the Cultural Revolution had already started. Young Americans were taking LSD en masse, and Leary became their figurehead. He was seen on national TV telling the young people to tune in, to turn on, tune in, drop out. And this was not a good time for a cultural revolution, because the US was at war with Vietnam. And the authorities noticed that people that took LSD didn't want to go to Vietnam and shoot other people. They saw this as a problem. They saw LSD as a threat to the very American institution. And so LSD was banned in the US in 1968. It was essentially the start of the war on drugs. In terms of the rhetorical use of the word, I mean, prohibition started earlier in the US, but the idea of this war on drugs started in the late 60s, early 70s. By international ratification of the UN Convention in 1971, psychedelic drugs became illegal internationally. And as a consequence of this, it led to the end of psychedelic science. It was too hard to conduct. In addition to the end of psychedelic science, it also led to lots of powerful myths with regard to LSD and other psychedelics. So, for example, there's the myth that LSD might contain strychnine, and this is taken from the DSM published in the year 2000. The DSM, where it says that one of the risks of taking LSD is strychnine poisoning, no citation, no reference is provided. In fact, strychnine has never been detected in LSD. It just shows the power of that propaganda campaign from the 60s and 70s in terms of influencing important texts, respected texts such as the DSM. The DSM-5 has now removed reference to strychnine as a risk from taking LSD. There's the myth around chromosomal damage, which emerged from a poorly conducted study in 1967, and the results of the study were refuted by two studies conducted later in the 70s, but those studies didn't get the media traction that the first study did, and so that myth persists today as well. Alongside that myth is the myth that if you take LSD, it's stored in your spinal fluid and it will be released at some point, causing a flashback, which links nicely to the next one, that if you take LSD, it'll send you insane. And a review of the literature of all of those clinical trials conducted between the 40s through to 1971 found that in less than 0.01% of cases was there any evidence of psychosis in these therapies. And there's further evidence. Okay, continuing, just to demonstrate how powerful this thing is. Yesterday I published a piece on the conversation about microdosing. Princess Gemma responded, not yourself, you've obviously ignored the risk of addiction, effects of psychedelic drugs on people with mental illness, bringing on neuroticism or overdosing risks. Why not microdose on cow manure and possum droppings? They have similar effects and are natural. Now, I'm not going to go into microdosing because that's a whole other session in and of itself. But I replied, risk of addiction? Let's everybody say tachyphylaxis. Word of the day, I know it's a big word, but it's an important one to understand the following statement. Psychedelics cannot lead to physiological dependence due to tachyphylaxis. Princess Gemma replies, fine, I know what the word means. There is no guarantee everyone will just take small doses. I researched the term. But you haven't addressed other health issues which can happen. But let's just hide those facts, shall we? I said, other health issues? Fire away. Vince and I'll be happy to respond. She said, you're supposedly a doctor? Then you should already know the other health risks that can arise. Numbness, disorientation and loss of consciousness, hallucinations, increase in blood pressure, stroke, increase in irregular heart rate and risk of suicide. Maybe do some more research. I responded, can you provide any peer-reviewed evidence showing 10 micrograms of LSD leads to any of those symptoms? Maybe you should review the literature before you start firing up on social media and provide a bunch of links, including a link to the safety, tolerability and pharmacokinetics of low doses of LSD provided to geriatrics that was recently published last year. So you can see how strong these myths are just through recent interaction on social media. And recent epidemiological data, albeit it's not the best way to gather data, shows that even outside of clinical trials, psychedelics might have positive effects. So in large population-based surveys, they've found lower incidence of mental health disorders among people who have a lifetime history of psychedelic use, lower incidence of suicide attempts, lower incidence of past-month psychological distress, and lower incidence of past-year suicidal ideation. So, the end of the embargo on psychedelic research really started with Dr. Rick Strassman's work. So, Rick was a psychiatrist who had been trained during the years when psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy was actually happening, and he had wanted to dream of becoming a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist himself, saw that, it got banned, and he wanted to get the research happening again. So he approached a trusted colleague, one of his mentors, who said, well, why don't you do a trial with dimethyltryptamine? The HREC committee, the ethics committee won't know what it is. And so he did. He got ethics approval to administer dimethyltryptamine to dozens of patients. And he was just doing really basic research. He was looking at the bloods, he was looking at levels of serotonin, and it was really basic research. And of course, the most interesting research that came out of it was not so much the quantitative stuff, but the qualitative analysis then of patients' reports that were administered dimethyltryptamine, which he wrote up in a book which is quite separate to the peer-reviewed publications that came from this research. But the most important thing about this research is it opened Pandora's box to this so-called Psychedelic Renaissance. So this is one picture of the number of publications published about psilocybin. So you can see, it sort of peaked in the 70s, dropped off, and then there's this increase. So in preparation for tonight, I thought I would just do my own quick search and continue it on, and you can see from 2004 through to 2020, there continues to be this exponential increase in publications on psychedelic science. So what have we learned through all of this new research? Well, we've developed an increased understanding of consciousness and the way psychedelics work, but for me as a clinical psychologist, the most important data that's come from all of this is indications that these might be promising therapies drug-assisted therapies for a range of mental health conditions for which we currently don't have great therapies for, or for which some patients don't respond to the therapies that we have. The therapies that we have for some of these conditions work well for some people, but not for others. And for those other people, the prognosis is often not great. So in terms of the consciousness aspect, neuroscience, in the 60s, we thought that psychedelics turned on parts of the brain, and that's what led to these visual effects and the changes in perception. And what we've now learned is that it's less about turning on parts of the brain and actually turning off a part of the brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is basically an interconnected system of systems within the brain. It's a bit like the brain's conductor. When we're talking to ourselves, when we're sort of thinking, that's the default mode network activated. It's actually, if my default mode network was not activated now, I would be having trouble having this conversation with you. People with depression and OCD tend to have a hyper-aroused default mode network. And psychedelic drugs tend to turn off the default mode network. So what does that look like? So the brain on the left is a normal brain, the brain on the right is the brain on psilocybin. So you can see when the default mode network is turned off, there is increased connectivity between different parts of the brain. By turning the default mode network off, a lot of crosstalk happens because the default mode network is like the conductor of the brain. And if you turn the conductor off, all of a sudden you get a cacophony of noise, but within that cacophony of noise might be some of the subjective effects that include big challenging existing beliefs, mystical and spiritual experiences, creativity, and many of the other subjective effects of psychedelics. In terms of psychedelic assisted therapy for depression, this was some data from an open-label trial at Imperial from 2016. They've just recently completed a randomised controlled trial in which they used escitalopram, or they used an antidepressant as a control condition, and psilocybin as the treatment condition. Interestingly, they found promising results, but still not. There wasn't a significant difference in their primary outcome measure. They found significant differences in a number of other measures, but not the one they listed on the clinical trial application as being the primary measure for depression. This idea that most of my work has been with alcohol and other drug use, and this quote in red comes from one of my colleagues and mentors, Professor Nicole Lee, who says, "Relapse is the most common outcome of the treatments we have at the moment." And so this data is from John Hopkins' study, which is an open-label trial of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of tobacco addiction. At a 6-month follow-up, 80% of people were no longer smoking. Now, if we compare that with the leading pharmaceutical treatment for tobacco addiction, which is Champix, it sits at about 25-27% efficacy. So these are incredibly impressive results. So this group is now stepping it up, like the Imperial group. They're now conducting a randomised controlled trial to develop further evidence. There's been several studies published now and phase 3 clinical trials underway looking at the potential for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to assist people who have been diagnosed with cancer and effectively allows people to die with dignity. So my research interest is actually more focused on MDMA than psychedelics per se, and MDMA is not typically considered a psychedelic. And I tried to put in one slide everything about MDMA that I've just talked about psychedelics. So MDMA, was being used in psychotherapy in the 70s to treat post-traumatic stress disorder and also to in couples work. Very effective treatment for couples work, as you can imagine. It became popular, like psychedelics, it was banned, and then of course we have all the propaganda that came out around ecstasy, and along with it is examples of the hype that's surrounding these drugs at the moment. So This is from Oprah magazine. Can a single pill heal your past? My answer is probably not. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy over the course of 18 weeks, in which there's 3 doses of MDMA, might be helpful, but I'm not sure a single pill can heal your past. So MDMA was banned in 1986, and that same year, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies was established by Rick Doblin as a response to that, to try to get this drug recognised as a medicine. And pretty much all of the research that's happened around the world with regard to MDMA has been sponsored by MAPS. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and they've just completed the first phase 3 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD with some really promising results. It hasn't been published yet. It will be published in the next month or 2. So rather than, because I can't show you that data, I'll show you some data from the very first study that they conducted 10 years ago now, the first phase 2 trial. So in this trial, people were given, recruited and then either assigned to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy where they were given a placebo. And so you can see from the data that at the start, people's severity of PTSD symptoms was about the same. But by the first dosing session, there's a significant difference between the MDMA group and the placebo group, and it continues to drop over time. So the 2 months post the last dose of MDMA, there's a significant difference between the 2 groups. Another way of looking at this data is that 83 participants who received MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and not placebo no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And these were participants that had not responded to at least 2 conventional treatments. That was one of the criteria for this first study, first phase 2 clinical trial. They followed these people up then 3.5 years later on average, and found not only was there a decrease in PTSD symptoms, but by the long-term follow-up at around 3.5 years later, nobody met treatment criteria. So we've gone from 83% of people and nobody now meeting criteria for PTSD. Following that study, 6 phase 2 trials were completed, and if you pull the data together, it found that at 12-month follow-up, 68% of participants receiving MDMA-assisted psychotherapy no longer met criteria for PTSD. So I've talked a lot about sort of what's happening internationally, and I wanted to bring the focus back to sort of what's happening here in Australia, which would create a bit of a segue to Matt's talk. So in 2011, Rick Doblin from MAPS came to Australia, presented at a conference, and got a group of us together who Rick is actually a very charismatic and persuasive fellow, and he said, you guys could be doing this research in Australia. And so he said, yeah, we can do this research in Australia. And so in 2011, PRISM was formed. We're tax deductible, we've got tax deductible gift recipient status. Board of 6 directors, 4 of them are unpaid, including myself, plus some part-time paid directors, including our executive director and a secretary role. We have partnerships with MAPS, USONA, who are the open science source of psilocybin internationally at the moment, and also the Vazadara Foundation. I was going to say our plan this year, but this has actually happened. We've now become a not-for-profit. We've now become a non-profit company limited by guarantee. So we formed in 2011, full of enthusiasm, based on what Rick had told us how we could do this research in Australia. In 2012, we submitted a protocol which was very similar to that of the protocol that generated the data which I showed you previously. We focused on war veterans strategically because we thought people would have sympathy and want to see this treatment offered for people, particularly Australian war veterans who have not responded to existing treatments. It was submitted to Bellberry, which is one of Australia's only independent ethics committee, and it wasn't rejected based on the methodology. It wasn't rejected based on the science. It was rejected because we tried to replicate the MAPS model, which is to use private clinics. And they said, for this research to go ahead, it needs to be done with a university partnership or in a hospital. And so in 2015, we submitted a similar protocol to Deakin University, which was vetoed by the Deakin Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, even before it hit the Ethics Committee, because the Deputy Vice Chancellor said, we're not doing this sort of research at our university. And so in 2017, we regrouped, Rick was back in the country, and we were basically saying, Rick, you sold us a good story, love the work you're doing over in the US, but we just can't do this in Australia, it's too hard. And Rick said, I'll paraphrase, he basically said, drink some concrete and harden up. Because it took him he started in 1985 and 1986, and it wasn't until 2011 that he was able to publish his first data from their clinical trial. And so he persisted. Around 2017, I moved to ECU, and in 2018, I then approached my Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, sent a couple of papers, and the Deputy Vice Chancellor said, why aren't we doing this research in Australia? I said, awesome, yes, let's do this research in Australia. We're then able to partner with a local hospital in Perth. I wrote myself a couple of notes for this session, which I think I've lost. What we're going to say. So, where are we at? In 2018, ECU provided support. In late 2018, myself and my co-therapist from Tedx University went over to the Netherlands to complete the MAPS training. In between 2018 and 2019, there was a lot of argument around the university lawyers as to how this was going to work in terms of insurance. By 2019, we were able to submit, we got permission to submit it back to Belbury, that original ethics committee, who then approved it in late 2019. Then it's been a process in 2020 of working through all of the bits and pieces that comes with running a clinical trial. So when I started this journey, the idea of running a clinical trial seemed quite romantic. Not anymore. When people ask me what are the key skills you need if you want to run psychedelic clinical trials, I say to them, you need to be keen to fill out a lot of electronic paperwork. So since getting ethics, we've registered with the TGA, so it's got federal approval. We've also got a Schedule 9 permit to hold MDMA in Perth, and we're currently working on installing a safe because we have to put the MDMA in a separate safe. It can't be in the same safe as the other drugs in the hospital. It has to be in its own safe because it might be bad influence on the other drugs. Once we get the safe, then we can import it, and hopefully we will start first Australian clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Last year, my colleagues over east at Monash University announced they were going to also do an open-label trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and they're about 18 months behind us. But they're catching up quickly because I'm working with them and helping them out with everything that I learned in terms of getting through this process to try to get them to the end point quicker. Prism's also the key funder of the psilocybin research at St Vincent's Hospital. We're also looking at doing research with 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, mindfulness-based research in which therapists are given psilocybin as part of a mindfulness-based retreat, which allows psychologists, psychiatrists that haven't had the opportunity to have a psychedelic experience to have that psychedelic experience so that they're able to work with patients in this modality, which I believe it's important to have had that experience to be able to work with patients. So that's pretty much my story and where I started in 2011 and where we're at now, which is very close to getting Australia's first clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy up and running. And I guess my final point to finish on would just be, in terms of all the hype and everything that's going on, is just that these are not these drugs are not panaceas, they're not silver bullets, and I worry that the hype associated with them is going to bring people disappointment, because it's not a single pill that's going to fix everything like the Oprah magazine was suggesting. It has to occur in the context of intention and psychotherapy and some of the other things that one of our other speakers will talk about. So on that note, I'll hand it over to Matt.